Goals, objectives, outcomes, isn't that just a different name for the same thing? It's actually not. Understanding the role of outcomes and outcomes-based instruction and the role of goals and objectives with competency-based instruction is the difference between preparing your learners for the future and preparing them for the test. What are your priorities? Welcome to another session of Learner's Mindset Discussion. I'm Dr. Dwayne Hrapnick, and my esteemed colleague is
Dr. Talissa Thibodeau.
Today, we're going to be exploring the idea or the notion or the differences between outcomes-based education and competency-based education. Right now, competency-based education is a hot topic. We hear about it in the news. There's a lot of institutions that are going down that route. And there are some people who are also talking about outcomes-based education. There are also a lot of people who mix the two ideas together, and it really can cause for some challenges. So we're going to be exploring those ideas and really clarifying what the difference is and where one methodology works better than another and what happens if you make those mistakes. So what are your thoughts before we jump into the core of this idea?
Yeah, I definitely see where, you have quality matters and some of those rubrics, especially in higher education, that kind of lean toward, the competency-based model. And I think in our program in particular, this is an important topic to discuss because we do run a little bit differently, actually a lot differently than a competency-based model. And I would like to kind of have this conversation so other folks can see that difference too. And that might help them kind of pick the pieces and put them together in terms of what we're trying to do and discussions we have when it relates to a learner's mindset in our discussions.
Well, I think before we get going, it might be worthwhile for me to sort of outline and just roughly define what competency-based education is and then what outcomes-based education is. And one of the key things that we need to do is identify the terms, and I think the terminology is where we run into difficulty. So competency-based education focuses on establishing goals that you're working towards, and those goals are usually knowledge-based, skill-based, and they're usually quite small, and they're very, very measurable. And you usually have a person working towards that particular goal, and there's objectives that they have. There's usually 3 or 4 or 5 objectives that would lead to a goal. And you do each objective, and then you're often tested on each stage. So when you're developing skills or abilities, you do the skill, you're tested on it. You do a skill, you're tested on it. You are exposed to vocabulary, and then you're tested on it. So competency-based education really has goals that are very, very small, very, very measurable, and standardized testing, multiple choice exams, quizzes, standardized rubrics, all that good stuff that we use to measure, the demonstration of a skill, knowledge, or ability falls under the category of competency-based education. It is teacher-controlled, and it is definitely not student-centered. It's very, very popular in polytechs or trades training programs, vocational programs. It's also widely used in higher ed, in introductory courses. A lot of your 100, 200 level courses in universities have a significant competency-based component because the students are being exposed to the language, the thesaurus, the terminology, the main ideas, and then they have exams on those ideas. And even when they write an essay, quite often those essays that they write are information-based, and they're really just showing that they have actually taken in the information, and they're able to identify and organize it and give it back to the instructor. So that's competency-based education. Occasionally, the notion of the outcomes-based education gets mixed in, but let me clarify outcomes-based education. And the term outcome really is the key here. And with outcomes-based education is you're designing instruction or designing a learning environment where there's an authentic, real world outcome that you're working towards. So the learner is creating something, they're building something. So in our digital learning and leading program, it's an outcomes-based program. I almost said competency, caught myself. It's an outcomes-based program where the learner creates an innovation plan that they then are going to be implementing. It's an outcome that they're doing outside of the program or in conjunction to the program. It's something that they are actually building, creating, and demonstrating, to their organization. They've got a specific audience. There's the opportunity for them to have choice, ownership, and voice, authentic learning opportunities, all those things. So the outcome is very, very different. And so these are the two differences. Have I missed anything? Perhaps you can just clarify, because sometimes another perspective will help the listener to make sure that we're on the right track.
Yeah, when I think of outcomes-based education, I think that when you shift that focus to authentic learning experiences, then it really kind of takes care of some of those competency-based things. It's like the best of both worlds. So here's the authentic learning experience, and they're applying their learning, such as maybe, blended learning, and they're looking at changing the shift in culture of teaching and learning and what they're looking to do. But all of the standards and the competencies and the knowledge and skills kind of support that authentic learning experience here. So I almost look at it where they're connected, but the outcomes-based learning gives them real, genuine learning opportunities to solve problems and make a difference in their worlds. And that is truly what I really wish we could move more into, especially even, you mentioned higher ed. I see this in elementary schools, where they develop curriculum mapping committees, and these committees come together and they design and then they align. Everyone has to be on the same page on the same day at the same time. And these are the standards we're going to cover. And there's really no application of those standards to the real world. And that's the piece I think we're missing and competency-based. And I'm not saying it's wrong. We need knowledge, we need skills, we need to know what those standards are to help us out as we move along, and teachers need that guide. But we need to shift that focus a little bit. And I know we have a video that goes over this, so changing focus part A and part B. So folks have questions or want to look more into that, definitely take a look at those videos on our YouTube channel as well.
Yeah, we also have an outcomes-based versus competency-based video, which we really go into this in very significant detail, and we talk about some of the advantages of doing outcomes-based. But you mentioned something that I think is really important, and that is you can have competencies within outcomes. Within an outcomes-based environment, in the sense that when a person is building a blended learning environment or a flipped classroom, which is the common terminology for it, well, they're probably going to have to learn how to work with the video equipment and to create their own videos. And so there's a certain amount of understanding, skill development, ability development that'll happen, but it happens within the context of creating that video for the flipped classroom, which is the outcome that they're working towards. So quite often you will have just-in-time competencies that a learner will engage on their own to satisfy the skill and ability that they need to get to that outcome. So outcomes-based learning provides that context where those competencies can fit. And I think it really can provide a wonderful opportunity for deep, rich, full learning. But there are some challenges with it. And I would say one of the biggest challenges is that you have to actually design a learning environment where you're looking at that big picture. And that's a challenge. But perhaps the biggest challenge is assessment. If everybody is working on their own project, so in the digital learning and leading program, every student has a unique innovation plan. Every student has a different audience. They have a different innovation plan. Now, there's some similarities. You'll have groups of students who are working on e-portfolios or maker spaces or STEM or one-to-one or mobile learning or online. So there's a bunch of categories that these innovation plans can fit into, but the needs and the audience and the requirements of those particular plans are unique to those learners' environment. And so each project is different. And it's difficult to scale a program up with large numbers where everybody is doing something different. So the advantage of competency-based education is, guess what? Standardized testing, the multiple choice exam, quizzes, it's great. You can automate it. You can put it on the computer. You don't have to mark it. Extremely time efficient because you can automate so many aspects of it because you're really looking at breaking down the competency to a goal and then a series of objectives. And you can test at any stage of the objective development or even the goal development through one of many standardized formats. You can also use standardized rubrics, the tool that a lot of students use instead of actually reading the assignment instructions. We've conditioned our students to look to a rubric because the rubric looks at what am I going to be measured on? What competency do I need to demonstrate? What is the goal? What is the objective that I need to reach in order to get that A? And so those rubrics really become the guide for the course, where the student simply looks at that competency and looks at what they need to satisfy, rather than taking a look at, well, what am I learning? What am I working towards? How am I going to make an impact on the world? How am I going to change my learning environment? So outcomes-based education really provides a much deeper, richer, fuller learning experience that can work very, very effectively. But it's tougher to measure, and that often gets in the way. What are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, going all the way back to when you mentioned setting up that significant learning environment, and I think we need to go down that path also. Before we get there, I was thinking about Daniel Pink's drive, the surprising truth behind what motivates us. And he talks a bit about autonomy and mastery and purpose. And he says that, when you assign that grade or give that monetary gift, you're essentially taking away some of that intrinsic value to what the learner would have towards what they're doing. And he found, and he refers to research, and he talks a bit about different companies and how they, the 20% time, and how, a lot of Google and some of their greatest and best innovative ideas, Gmail came from that 20% time. My point there is we have to move in outcomes-based. We're looking at their critical thinking, their growth and development as a learner. Did they fail and fail forward? And that's part of the learning environment too. Their presentation, articulation of ideas, those types of things. Are they growing, learning? So how do we measure this? We really look at growing, learning, measuring. We measure that by growth, learning, and articulation, presenting their ideas. Did they make an impact? What did they learn through it? How did they learn from failures, mistakes? How did they learn to navigate the process? And that, again, kind of puts together the significant learning environment in which we model and do in the DLL program. So, to move people away, the competency-based model, the grades, the rubric, don't bother looking at the instructions. To move them away from that, they have to start focusing on investing in themselves as a learner and looking at innovation plans as opportunity for change and growth. Does that make sense? Lots of
it definitely does. Now, I do want to qualify something as well, and I don't want us to sound like we're against competency-based education, because it has its place, it has its role. It serves a very specific purpose, and if you do it well, it can work exceptionally well, and there's nothing wrong with it. We happen to work with graduate students, and we work with you work with an honors college, and so you work with students at a higher level. We also do professional development, where we're looking at what people are creating in their learning environments, and so we're always looking at that outcome. So with the outcomes-based model, you are following a backward design methodology. You're looking at the softer skills, the value added, the notion of the critical and analytical thinking that is often difficult to measure. But these are the skills and abilities that the business world is arguing that we're not doing a good job in higher education of preparing or equipping our students with. A lot of people graduate from with an undergraduate degree, and there's a fair amount of research to show that they really aren't equipped to go out there and solve problems, because they might have spent 2 or 3 out of the 4 years really just doing competency-based education, where they're preparing to regurgitate information on an exam. And so quite often, in some of the, 4th year programs, some of the students would be exposed to this, but it's done so often within the context of a special project, and it becomes the exception as opposed to the rule. And so I think we're doing our students a disservice, especially in higher ed, especially in some of the humanities programs. Actually, I'd say across the board, because we see that problem in science as well, where science, because it's so very specific and can be measured, that you break everything down into a competency-based perspective, even at the higher levels, when the key thing with teaching students science is having them do science as opposed to learn about science. And there's a number of researchers who are making the argument that we are preparing a bunch of scientists and researchers who really don't know how to do science until they get into their doctoral studies, or they do their postdoc, where they're actually finally exposed to the real world of the scientific method. And then, all those many years of preparation ahead of time really were for naught, in the sense that, the student had the ability to regurgitate a bunch of information on exams, but that ability to look at things differently, to make those mistakes, to fail forward, to problem solve, to work through these challenges, is something that often doesn't happen until later on in their academic careers, or when they're doing, higher level graduate work or post-doc work. So, I think we are shortchanging some students in some regards by overemphasizing the competency. And the reason that we do, measurement. Measurement. We use tools like Blackboard and Moodle and Desire to Learn. And guess what? One of the biggest reasons people will use this is that you can automate your standardized tests. You can automate your quizzes. You can automate the whole exam process through these tools. And a lot of our digital tools that we're using are used not for the benefit of helping the learner develop as a full individual, to help them, become these critical and analytical thinkers that can solve problems and be innovative. But quite often we're using digital tools to simply measure the ability for a student to meet that objective and meet a number of objectives that will meet that goal. And it's very easy to measure. And so I think we're doing a lot of our students a disservice by the fact that we're starting to rely on a lot of these tools to do that competency-based perspective. And quite often we make the big mistake of saying, well, guess what? The student has the ability on their own time with his automated piece of software to control their learning, because the program will identify that if they are able to do these mathematical equations, well, then they go on to the next set. And if they make a certain mistake with a certain mathematical equation, the program will automatically take them down another path. And that ability to control that feedback, people make the mistake and see that as being student-centered. Student-centered is an outcomes-based activity. So competency-based learning is also student-centered. Well, no, it's not. It's not. Having that ability to control that time and having that feedback loop doesn't necessarily make it student-centered. It just makes the drill more efficient. But it's still a competency-based format that should really be reserved for the lower order thinking skills on Bloom's taxonomy. Right? We're talking knowledge, remembering, a bit of integration, at most, maybe some application in terms of showing how these ideas come together. But when we look at the higher order thinking skills of analysis and synthesis and creation, well, competency-based education doesn't take you to that level. Outcomes-based does, because it's looking at building that authentic learning opportunity that provides a context for doing that creation, for doing that analysis, for doing that synthesis. So I think we make a mistake by convoluting the two ideas. You had a few more thoughts you wanted to jump in. I've been going on. I better stop. Your turn.
I was thinking about one of the chief differences between competency-based and outcomes-based education is that my role as an instructor shifts. I am not teaching you content, and I am actually coming alongside you and coaching and facilitating and working with you to help you as a student then develop your innovation plans and go through that process of everything that you described and providing the context and the authentic learning opportunities. And as you were speaking, I started thinking back to my third grade years. There's such a big emphasis on AR, accelerated reader. A lot of our elementary teachers know what I'm talking about. And those are basic recall questions that the computer will ask through a repository of questions. Basic recall about the story that you read. There is no comprehension. There may be a fill in the blank here and there, but the heavy emphasis on those AR scores. And we'll have an AR party if you get so many AR points. Well, if there's 5 questions and it's basic recall, and one of the questions, I kid you not, I'll never forget this, was what was located on the table next to Sally? And it was like a book or something. And the students had to remember that. I thought, how is that deepening their learning and are providing a context for them to solve problems. I remember thinking this back in my third grade years before I came into higher ed. I thought, why are we putting so much emphasis on these digital tools that are just emphasizing basic recall? And we're going to reward them for that. Wow. We're really, like you said, missing the point here. We could be rewarding them for taking on a project that's larger and bigger than them. Doesn't everyone want to be part of something a little bit bigger than them? You know, these kids that go out into the community and raise funds or money for different things and solving problems and helping individuals. That to me is where learning is deeper and is more authentic than what is located on the table next to Sally. Unfortunately, we have a great system of tools out there like Pearson creating these things and districts adopting them because it's the easier route to go. It's easier to tell the student, you know, what they need to know than it is to help them come up with an innovative solution to solve a problem.
Well, I think you raised a good point, and it's not just Pearson. I think just think of our recent experience with QM, Quality Matters, right? The emphasis with Quality Matters, some of the feedback that you received, and I've received this in the past going through the process with online courses, is that, well, you don't have a to-do list in your course, and what about the way that students are supposed to respond? How many times do they have to respond in the discussions, right? The emphasis with QM is a competency-based emphasis, right? It's checking these items off a list. Well, when you've got an outcomes-based course, a to-do list really doesn't help because the student's project is going to determine what they need to do. And quite often in well-developed competency or outcomes-based courses, you've got one big project at the end and everything is leading up to it. And the individual to-do list is, or the ability to build that to-do list is much more important to the learner than it is for you as the instructor to give it to the learner, because you don't know what their project is. So it's actually impossible to have a to-do list of what they need to do, other than, you've got sort of general overview, but then all you're doing is repeating the outcomes of each of the modules. And so the to-do list becomes redundant. But quite often, a lot of these people who are doing this QM assessment are not educators, and they're just simply checking things off a list. And even if they are educators, unfortunately, a lot of our educators who don't really have a background in learning will just assume that these to-do lists and checklists and rubrics, standardized rubrics, is the way that we do it. And sometimes this conversation about the difference between competency-based education and outcomes-based education, well, it really is a moot point because it's the same thing. You can call it an outcome or you can call it a goal. It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. You can interchange these terms. I think we do a disservice to our learners when we make those mistakes. And we also try to force our educators into these models, these competency-based models that are really designed for the lower order thinking skills and are really designed for really introductory and rudimentary type courses. And in a graduate program like the one that we have, it's almost embarrassing to have people advocating for competency-based education, because the whole goal of a graduate program is you're supposed to be creating something, whether it's writing a thesis or you've got a graduate project, you're supposed to be creating something. So it should all be outcomes-based. And the competencies are then left up to the learner, and they do that skill development when they need to satisfy a certain requirement as they're going along. So, I think systemically we really get in the way of effective use of competencies and outcomes, and it makes me chuckle, but at the same time it's quite frustrating because you are being asked by administrators to do something which they're completely ignorant of the fact it doesn't apply in an outcomes-based setting. And you then have to educate these people in terms of why you can't do what they're asking you to do. It isn't that you're being difficult. Actually, it doesn't work in the context that we're using. And quite often, I sometimes find it's difficult to have educators move down that path because they automatically think that we're being difficult, or, well, boy, if you don't give the learner a to-do list, well, then you're just giving the learner all this control. Well, yeah, student-centered is part of the outcomes-based model, and the student having that control, having that choice will lead to ownership, which leads to them developing their voice. And remember, that real world project is a context that helps to drive it. And so this is an ongoing educational process that we're always involved in. And that's why we make a video like this every once in a while. And we've got several, I've made several videos over the years on the differences between the two. And it never really seems to take hold, does it?
It takes, dealing with resistance takes time. Change takes time. We acknowledge that in several of our videos. I was thinking as you were talking that this is not just in the world, education. This is in corporate world too. Call centers, I just read a really great examples of how certain companies have, and we know this, they'll have, you call in for customer service and you can tell when the agent on the other end is just reading a script, something that the company wrote up. And they just read the script and get off the phone as soon as you can. You're going to be timed on that. Then we're going to submit your call for quality assurance and all this other stuff. Well, some of the best companies that thrive, and Pink talks about this in his book, are those that kind of abort that script, take as long as they need, and even do a call center from home. Customers are happy. The company starts to soar. This is customer service, really. And so, I'm thinking about this in terms of, what we're doing in terms of customer service. If you take that to the education context, we are not just, in our program, an outcomes-based model, it's not a matter of providing a scripted, customer service with a time length and it's got to be, you got to be sitting in a cubicle to do it. No, that's not the way things work. That's not how the company probably thrived or built what they do and what they do best at. It's different, abort that, think about things in a different way, a more innovative way, work from home, answer the calls and take as long as you need. And if that leads to better results, why aren't we doing that? What are we missing here? So my thinking is moving into the outcomes-based model is definitely more learner-centric, just as doing that in a company is customer-centric, right? Where do we want our focus and emphasis to be?
Yeah, you've raised some really important points, and this brings us to why this doesn't happen. And I would argue that, let's say in your corporate example, one of the biggest reasons is that managers would be afraid of losing control. Well, if my employee isn't in that cubicle, how am I supposed to monitor them? If they're at home, they might be doing other stuff. Well, research is quite clear that people work from home are actually much more productive, and they actually work more and do much more than people who are in that cubicle.
I can attest to that.
Yeah. So, but it's that control. It's that control issue. Think about from a teacher's perspective, if every student is doing a different project, you can lose control, right? And that's a scary thing, because remember, in the competency-based model, it's really about that clearly defined goal, and then those objectives that get you to that goal. And the teacher is the authority, is the person who controls that, and they often are the source of ultimate authority in that whole process. And when you move away from that control-based model, anything can happen. Yeah, like innovation and learning and growth and failure and moving forward. Yeah, a lot of things can happen. Learning can happen. Because I think it's really important to point out that learning really is within the control of the learner. Now, we can get students to regurgitate information, we can get students to give you the answers to a question, but when it comes to actual learning, making those meaningful connections, well, there's a gray area in there that is really solely dependent upon the learner. And I think the more responsibility that we give to the learner, and the more we get out of the way in terms of taking control, and the more we can come alongside a learner as a coach, as a guide, as a facilitator, as a mentor, I think it helps the learner to make those meaningful connections and then make that learning their own, which is what the business world, the corporate sector, is really looking for right now. They don't want students who can regurgitate information on an exam. Well, that's what Google is for. You can look it up real quick. If you can look up something on Google, and that shouldn't be part of an exam question, because that doesn't make any sense. Then again, this shouldn't be on an exam, right? You want to take a look at what can people do to make a difference, to create, to improve their environment. Now, that is if you're willing to go down that path of outcomes-based education, and you're willing to do that. But you've got to be willing to give up some control, actually a lot of control. And it isn't just giving a student a choice between 2 options or 3 options. Well, it's really allowing the student to identify the environment that they're at, identify something that they can do. And you might have to have them do a project that is completely outside of the scope of what you've done before. And that'll be okay, because quite often the learner is probably more of a subject matter expert than you are. You understand the process, you can guide and direct them. I'm talking about a graduate learner in the program that we have in the DLL program. You know, a lot of people are working in a specific environment. They know what needs to be done. And if you can give them a context of doing things in an innovative way, you can guide them through that process, and give them the ability to make those decisions and still guide and direct them and not have to be a subject matter expert. But it's scary. That means you aren't an expert in all things. And as educators, we often want to be the expert. We want to be in control, right? What are your thoughts on that? Because you spent a fair amount of time in elementary or primary education where control is really important. And now you've been in higher ed where you've gone down this path of outcomes-based learning. What are the differences you see?
It's pretty simple, because the more control that I took, the less autonomy my learners could take. What I did, and this was the year I won a really big award in education in the state of Florida, one of the top awards in the state. And what I did was, and to me, it wasn't anything special. It was something I felt I should already be doing. I gave the kids kind of a blanket, and this was kindergarten, them a blanket assignment. It was a really, we're studying the next month the solar system. You can pick any planet, any aspect, anything in that solar system, and how you present it is up to you, and how you organize it and how you share it is up to you. These are kindergarten 5-year-olds. I would help them do a little research. Parents would help. We'd all come together, and they came up with incredible projects. And they became the expert, like you said, subject matter, and 5 years old, 6 years old. So one little boy I'll never forget, his name was Matthew. He did Mars. He brought in a tub of sand. This is what it would feel like on Mars. Of course, he had mixed it with a whole bunch of stuff, rocks and whatever else he had. But he was up there and he owned that presentation. 5 and 6 year old, you think they can't get up there and present? They sure can. They'll get up there and tell you everything they know, especially if it's something they're passionate about. Well, these kids enjoyed learning about the solar system, got them hyped up, got them excited, and then they would work on their project. He brought in an entire I had kids who brought in asteroid belts all over the huge poster board, and we actually took it and put it into a museum. So they went and did a space museum, took it to the next level, and took all their projects and shared them out. What it was an opportunity for them to have control, ownership over their own learning. They picked what they wanted to do, and then they shared that. And the conversations around that just sparked, and people were getting excited. Parents were getting excited. People from the business, the news came into my classroom and said, "What is she doing that's different than every other kindergarten in the district?" Really, it was just giving them the control. I didn't have to control all that. It was just setting the context and giving them some ideas and something they could look at and do. Then I came alongside them and asked questions and encouraged them. 5 and 6 year olds, they can do it. They can do it. Unfortunately, some of our standardization practices have kind of pulled away from that, and I think we need to get back to that. We need to stand together in education and really make the argument that authentic learning is where our kids really gain the competencies, knowledge, and skills that they can gain outside of what we define for them.
Yeah, again, in the DLL program, we deal with a lot of different people at a lot of different levels, and probably one of the biggest pushbacks that I hear is in elementary education, right? Kindergarten, grade 1, 2, 3 teachers. A lot of folks focus on, well, there's rudimentary skills. There's, everything is about helping these kids develop these skills that we can assess and see where they're at and measure them and make sure that they're making the progress they need. And there's a significant pushback on using authentic learning opportunities because you've got all these standards that you have to meet. How do you fit that into a rubric? How does that fit within the state standard? How do you measure that? How did you measure those projects for those kids? Or do you need to measure those projects for the kids? Are those kids ever going to forget what they've learned? I would argue that they're probably not. When you spend all that time and effort working towards something, it becomes part of you. But how do you measure that? And how would you answer a teacher who pushes back on that, saying, well, what about the standards? And what about the standardized testing that's necessary? How does that help your students pass the exam?
Well, honestly, it's kind of it's weird that you asked that, because the thing that I always had in my back pocket, I knew the standards really well. I could backwards map anything I did to a literacy, social studies, or science standard. All I had to do is backwards map it. Not hard. Now, assessment-wise, it's almost like, they did their work. They did their homework. They came in there ready. They had their project. They stood up in front of the class and presented. I mean, was there anything I really needed to get down to that minute detail that I had to mark? No, because when I knew they had crossed the line of, okay, I don't know a lot about this to becoming an expert, I knew that they knew what they needed to know. And then that's it. I mean, it wasn't a difficult thing to measure. And I can't recall the exact, I don't even know that I used a rubric. I don't think I needed to at that point. They were young. So
you said something I think that's really important, and I think we should key on this a little bit. You knew the standards well enough that you could make the connection between what they were doing and how it mapped to a particular standard. I think this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face, is that educators often don't understand the standards well enough to understand the variety of ways that you can actually map to that standard. And they are willing to trust Pearson, or they're willing to trust a district, or they're willing to trust other people who've gone before them to use those traditional standardized methodologies of recipe and regurgitation, because it's been tried and true, and our school does relatively well in the exams. So why rock the boat? Why change that? And I think we've got a systemic problem there, where the system of standardization that started over 120 years ago and was based on some really negative ideas is something we're still using today, and we're limiting the potential of our learners. It's a devastating thing. I think of the author of The More Beautiful Question, who points out that our kids stop asking questions. There's a correlation between the reduction in the number of questions that kids are asked with the increase in time that they spend in school. And guess what? You don't need to ask questions, because nobody's interested in you asking a question as a learner. Everybody's just interested in the answer you're going to give them on that standardized test. And yet asking questions is so fundamental to learning. We're really, I think, doing our kids a disservice by allowing this overemphasis on the competencies to happen, and that ease of measurement that we see with digital tools. The digital tools really have just become tools that can be used to actually further the standards and the standardization process of that information regurgitation. And that's not the real purpose of the tools. Digital tools should actually aid in creativity, communication, collaboration, development. Digital tools have enormous power. And if we're only using them for regurgitation of information, what a waste. What do you think about that?
I agree with you. And all too often, that's the misconception of using digital tools, is that, you just put the student on there and the Compass Odyssey program develops a learning path, and, I'm using digital tools, and really it's good for reinforcement of skills. I'm not saying it's bad. It's good when you have to have, who kids need some remediation. That's good. But it shouldn't drive what we do. What drives what we do should be learning outcomes, authentic learning experiences, and backwards mapping to what the kids need to know to get to that point, what they care and what they're passionate about to get to that point, so that they can crave and love, have a lifelong love for learning. And that's what we want to implant and instill in them. Not, pass this test and you can do this. The credentialing in society, that's what we're promoting through all of this. So I proposed, and you do too, a shift. It's just a matter of getting getting there. It's going to take a little while. It's that change element we're dealing with, and I think that that may be one of the next episode of our learners mindset discussion. Why change is so hard, maybe in education.
Yeah, I think we're at that point where we can move on. So just to sort of summarize and wrap up, competency-based education, wonderful, useful methodology for getting some of those fundamentals in place. Effective tool, wonderful tool, useful in introductory levels, in a few places where you've got some credentialing as necessary, but it shouldn't be the be all and end all, and it shouldn't drive everything else. More importantly, with outcomes-based education, you're looking at who the learner will become, right? And within the context of what they'll become, what are they going to be able to do? What do they create? What do they design? What do they develop? What problems are they solving? What real world problems are they solving? And so with that authentic learning opportunity as a context, the outcomes that you develop then will lead a learner to that real world project they're working on. The exciting thing is with outcomes-based education, the competencies can fit inside, because then the learner is in control of when they need to develop that skill and ability as they're going along. For example, if a teacher is working on blended learning and they're not really comfortable with creating videos, well, guess what? They'll spend a little bit of time on YouTube, develop those skills that are necessary to create the YouTube video, and develop that competency as they're developing the skill and ability to actually create that blended learning environment, right? Which is the bigger goal. So again, the right tool and the right job, the right design for the right process. But ultimately, if we focus on who we want our learners to be, and who we want them to become, and how do we want to prepare them for the future, then we really do need to look at outcomes. And so we do need to further this conversation. And at every point, I think it's our responsibility to educate some of these people, the QM people, the Pearson people, all these people who are forcing us systemically into a competency-based model, that there actually is another way, and another way that is well established, tried and true, that doesn't mean we use a standardized test. That doesn't mean we use a to-do checklist. It doesn't mean that we use a traditional checklist rubric. It means that we look at learning from a different perspective. We look at learning as making those meaningful connections. And the outcome, that real world authentic learning opportunity, is that outcome that the learner is working towards, that provides that context for everything else that they do. So yeah, I think we're going to have to keep on working towards this and repeating it and educating people that this is a wonderful opportunity. If you create those significant learning environments where you give your learner choice, ownership, and voice through authentic learning opportunity, you're doing outcomes-based education, and you're making a difference in the world. And hopefully you're changing the world one learner at a time. Ha. How do you like that for a close?
Perfect. I'd wrap it up.
Yeah. Take care.